Another dimension of critical thinking breakdowns that isn't exactly an issue about truth and falsity is the ways in which we use language. I gave an example of this earlier when I talked about equivocation, which is one of the standard informal fallacies. But now I want to sort of enlarge that example to a much larger set of concerns about how language works and how it influences our thinking. Language is obviously one of the main tools of human intelligence, and language is one of the main ways in which we expand and enlarge can expand and enlarge our understandings of the world. But language can also be a way of inhibiting and restricting and channeling our thinking into certain narrow or cliched or impoverished channels. And identifying how it does that and when it's doing that, I think, is itself a really crucial aspect of critical thinking. It relates to some of the aspects in Harry Frankfurt's book about BS, but I think it's worth a whole little section on its own. So the classic source on this is George Orwell's essay Politics in the English Language, which is a general reflection on sort of the way in which language is used politically. And then we see an actual implementation of some of those ideas in his famous novel 1984 that was written, I think, about 3 years after that essay. And here are some of the reflections that Orwell's essay invite. One is the ways in which cliches often operate to stop thinking, to stop thought, or to stop conversation. So I used to work with somebody here, and one of his favorite expressions was, "We're just going to have to agree to disagree." And he used it all the time. And what he meant was, "I'm not really interested in what you have to say." That's what he really meant. But he wanted to say it in a way that sounded collegial and friendly and jovial, like, well, we'll just have to, we're buddies, we're friends, we'll just have to agree to disagree. Well, we weren't friends. And, you know, if the first time somebody uses it, maybe you think that it's sincere. The 20th time somebody uses it, you start realizing that it's a way of stopping thinking, stopping conversation, stopping disagreement. And cliches generally often are examples of what I just said, channeling our thinking into sort of cliched or stereotyped forms of expression, where everybody around the room kind of nods their head because they've all heard the cliche or the slogan or whatever a million times, but they don't realize that in that moment, thinking stops or conversation stops. Another way in which this happens are buzzwords. Management speak is rife with buzzwords and phrases that become popular, and in that sometimes, again, can sort of stop thinking or stop original thinking. So one phrase that you maybe hear all the time is something like optimize the results. And everyone says, yes, of course, that's what we want to do. We want to optimize the results. No one really disagrees with that. But of course, what does that actually mean? Does it just mean let's do the best we can? But this is an example of where a word optimize sounds neutral, sounds statistical, sounds quantitative and objective, but actually maybe shields deeper value judgments that aren't on the table, that aren't revealed, in the same way that Mary being a good teacher, because she teaches at a particular school, really clouds the underlying question, which is, what do you mean by a good teacher? And how do you know a good teacher when you get one, when you find one? So terms like optimize the results are actually deeply value laden, but they look neutral. And we don't often stop to question how those buzzwords operate. In 1984, Orwell's famous language was newspeak, which was a language that was consciously engineered, it's probably not a bad word for it, consciously engineered to restrict people's thinking. And there's many examples in 1984, but one of them is that everything is either good or bad. Those are the adjectives that people use to evaluate. And the only thing is whether something is really good, double plus good is I think the term in newspeak, or really, really bad. But everything is either good or bad. So family is good. Homosexuality is bad. And of course, in the real world, most things are not simply good or bad. Some things are both, like ice cream. We need other kinds of evaluative terms than good or bad, because good or bad are fairly absolute and dichotomous ways of evaluating things. It's either one or the other. And in all those ways, that simple element of vocabulary starts channeling the way we think, the way we make value judgments, the ways we don't make value judgments, because we don't have a very clear vocabulary for articulating them. And so little by little, the principle, Orwell's principle here, is that our thinking begins to coincide with our language. And the restrictions and channels or categories of our language become the restrictions and categories and channels of our thinking. Bureaucracies, I think, often operate this way, because one of the ways in which bureaucracies thrive is by standardizing certain kinds of language and vocabulary within which the bureaucracy operates. So everybody seems to be on the same page because they're all using the same buzzwords or terminology for certain things, even when they might mean something very different by those terms. They're the terms that are settled on. So I'll give you an example. I shouldn't do this, but my own department, we have something called the Early Research Project that all the PhD students need to do. There are 30-some faculty in my department. I am sure that every single one of them means something different by the Early Research Project. We have the term, every student has to do it because that's what the rules say, but what it actually means, why they have to do it, how early is up to, I can tell you, an enormous range of interpretations, but the phrase is sort of unquestioned. Of course, every student has to do the Early Research Project because some web page says, every student does an early research project, but people mean different things by it. They enforce it in different kinds of ways. And so this term, which again, could open up some interesting questions about how you evaluate students and what are the criteria, what kinds of feedback should you give students, sometimes prevents those conversations because everybody signs on to the terminology even though they attach very different meanings to it. So bureaucracies often thrive, I think, on standardizing language, or at least standardizing the use of language, even though it actually prevents or interferes with the conversations, the underlying conversations that people really need to have or should be having. One of the examples I'd like to use in this is that it's like there's a slogan that the fish is the last creature to discover the existence of water, because that's just what they're in. Language is like that. Our language is so much a part of us that it can be sometimes very difficult. It's invisible to us in a way, and it can take a special effort of reflection, or somebody else, maybe sometimes somebody from a different language or a different culture, pointing out to us something about our language that goes, oh, why do we look at things that way? Why do we use that terminology? Gendered pronouns are an example that I think we're getting very sensitive to, that these seemingly neutral decisions like using he as the generic pronoun I don't think most people think of that as a neutral decision anymore, even though that's the standard written in the grammar books. Descartes, I'll do a little bit of philosophy 101. Descartes' famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, that he believed was an absolutely indubitable premise that could not be doubted, because if I think, I therefore must exist, actually turns out to be an artifact of language, because Indo-European languages tend to have verb forms that imply a particular actor in the verb forms, I think. But there are many languages that aren't structured that way. And therefore, this obviously undoubtable truth was actually an artifact of his own language that he couldn't doubt, because he took, in this case, Latin for granted and didn't stop to think that it's possible that other languages might be structured in different ways. It's very hard to step outside of your language unless you're bilingual, unless you do more traveling, and really realize that every language and every vocabulary, every grammar and syntax for that matter, has certain kinds of assumptions built into it that can be very hard to stand outside of and to question, or to recognize, as I said at the beginning, how it drives our thinking in certain sorts of ways. One way to sum up what I'm saying is that we think of language as a tool. That's the way we often describe it. It's something that we use to navigate the world, to accomplish our purposes, to communicate with other people, to express ourselves, etc. But language, like other kinds of tools, are not just things that we use, but they're also things that use us. That's Heidegger's phrase, that language uses us. And the idea there is that we're creatures of our language in ways that we may be conscious of, usually we're not conscious of, and that language has a logic unto itself. And our vocabulary, etc., have assumptions built into them that it can be very hard to stand outside of and recognize. And when we simply fall into a certain way of talking, for example, within certain kinds of bureaucratic settings, falling into a vocabulary, a set of expressions that we use all the time because all of us within this organization know what these words mean or know what these phrases mean, or we're in meeting rooms where people use these cliches or buzzwords and everyone around the table nods their head because everyone knows what it means, actually are in many cases impediments to understanding and impediments to critical thinking because they don't get questioned. People just sort of fall into them. And to that extent, they are being used by the language. And their thought, which could be, as I said at the beginning, opened up by language, that should be opened up by language in terms of exploring new possibilities, new ways of saying things, new vantage points or perspectives on presumed truisms, in many other cases becomes in fact just the opposite, a mechanism of control and restriction that actually limits our possibilities. And like the fish in water, we don't often notice or realize what it's doing to us. One of the questions that I think might be asked here is, what do you do in situations like this when you're starting to suspect that maybe language is becoming this restriction or constraint and not this liberating possibility? And I think there's a few things. One is to be sensitive to the emergence and the power of buzzwords or cliches. There's a reason why they become cliches. There's a reason why people repeat them over and over again. They express something, or at least they originally express something that is significant and meaningful. But like a cliche, they start being repeated simply because they're familiar. And even that original meaning or association that might have been significant loses its meaning over time, like the expression, let's just agree to disagree. It's a perfectly reasonable thing to say in certain contexts, but when it becomes habitual, then it becomes something else. And so recognizing when within a group or within an organization, when certain kinds of terms or concepts or phrases are becoming a little bit cliched, to just pause. One of the philosophers' standard questions is, what do we mean by X? Philosophers can be incredibly annoying nuisances, as Socrates found in Athens. But the power of simply stopping and stepping outside a discussion or a phrase and saying, wait a second, we keep using the word or phrase X. What do we mean by that? Can be incredibly useful. You can't do it all the time. I mean, there's work to be done. And the purpose of the discussion is not philosophical reflection. But I think selectively it can be invaluable, even if you're not a philosopher, to simply pause the conversation and say, we keep using this phrase, X, or this word, X, like we all know what it means. And I'm not sure that we do all know what it means, or I'm not sure that we all mean the same thing when we're using it. So can we just take 5 minutes to sort of open this up and see whether this is really what we ought to be talking about or want to be talking about or think that we're talking about? And often in that moment of reflection, people realize that in fact that phrase isn't necessarily what the issue is. Like much of critical thinking, this often requires a person to be willing to sort of go against the tide a little bit, to step outside the consensus or the conventional approach or the conventional language, to look at it from the outside and draw attention to it and ask a question about it. And as I said, that can be annoying, and sometimes it's seen as not being a team player, or, hey, we're here to talk about this problem and to solve this problem, not to engage on conceptual word reflections. But the key point is, at least selectively, that clarifying that word or that phrase or understanding it or diagnosing how it's being used or misused actually can help to cope with the underlying problem in a more effective way. And that's the case, I think, that has to be made, that it's not just philosophical, philosophically being a nuisance, but that in fact it is about trying to say, if every student is going to be required to do an early research project, let's be clear about what we mean by early. Let's be clear about what this means, what its purpose is, and how it's going to be evaluated, and not just sort of jump from the idea that it's there on the page and there's a requirement that everybody does it, to an assumption that we all know what it means, or that, as I said before, that we all mean the same thing, even though we keep using the same phrase. Under that discussion is something educationally really useful, I think, if you open up the question.